Hey there, retro games fans, this is Andy C from Piece of 8-Bit. I am back with another Amiga topic for this week as part of my Month With series, where I am living with the Amiga 500 Plus sitting behind me here. Thank you so much for all the engagement on the topics that we've had so far. We've looked at how it was such a big success in the EU, we've looked at some of the games, all sorts of things, and it's been great to provoke some debate around this really special piece of technology. So I figured this week should be no different. Now, when people talk about the Commodore Amiga, you'll often hear the same phrase repeated over and over again. It was ahead of its time. We've talked a lot about how much of an impact this machine had in the mid-80s for sure over these last few weeks, but it's one of those statements that gets thrown around so often that you could probably dismiss it as nostalgia. I mean, let's face it, every generation thinks the machines that they grew up with were special. So here's the thing, right? The Amiga 1000 launched in 1985, which was a really incredible piece of kit for the time. But I think what really set the scene was the launch of the hugely popular Amiga 500 in 1987, almost 40 years ago. And even today, people still talk about it with a level of affection that is perhaps almost unmatched in computing history. So the question then was the Amiga genuinely ahead of its time, or are we simply looking back at it through those rose-tinted glasses? Now, we've spoken about the phenomenon of the Amiga in Europe, and we've asked how it matched up to the 16-bit era consoles for gaming as well. So today, what we're going to basically do then is round off those topics and look at what made the Amiga truly different. We're going to look at what it did years before its competitors and whether it really did deserve its reputation as the computer from the future. Let's dive in. Okay, so to understand why the Amiga felt so revolutionary, what we need to do is take ourselves all the way back to the mid-1980s and try and imagine what the world looked like back there in the mid-1980s. Now, here in the UK and Europe, many homes still have machines like the Spectrum, the Amstrad CPC, and of course the legendary Commodore 64. In businesses, IBM PCs were really just starting to become the standard. Most computers displayed relatively simple graphics, most produced pretty basic electronic sound, and most could only really do one thing at a time. So in 1985, the Commodore released the Amiga, and that featured custom chips dedicated to graphics and sound. It had a color palette of over 4,000 colors, 4,096 colors, 4-channel stereo sampled audio, hardware acceleration for graphics, a graphical operating system. That would have just looked like something completely from the future back then. And it wasn't just better than many computers of the day, it felt like it was a completely new generation. I vaguely remember it appearing at the time and being absolutely blown away by what I was seeing. It just felt space age. And that's why when many people, myself included of course, saw an Amiga for the first time in action, they still remember that experience decades later. Now for many of us, again, myself included, we didn't properly encounter the Amiga until the early 1990s. The landscape was already changing by this point, but the Amiga still felt really amazing some 3, 4, 5 years later. It basically down to the head start that it had over many of its personal computer contemporaries. Only really the 16-bit consoles, I would say, arriving in the late 80s and early 90s showed that it was possible to rival the Amiga, at least in gaming from a graphics point of view, but the PC era was still some years away. So next up, multitasking. Now today, we take multitasking completely for granted, right? You might have a web browser open, you might have Spotify playing music, you might have a chat app open somewhere, and you've probably got something downloading in the background. That is completely normal in 2026, even on your mobile phone. In 1985, it just wasn't. The Amiga's operating system, Workbench, was capable of what's called preemptive multitasking. In basic, simple terms, it could run multiple applications at the same time without grinding to a halt. This is the sort of stuff we learnt about in GCSE computer studies. You could copy files while you were doing something else. You could run multiple programs simultaneously, something, again, like I say, we would take for granted now. You could switch between these tasks with ease, and whilst today that might not sound particularly impressive, you got to remember that Windows wouldn't gain that proper preemptive multitasking for years. Now, for home users in the mid-1980s, the Amiga essentially offered a glimpse of how personal computing would eventually evolve. It basically set the scene, and by mid-1980s standards, certainly to me and to many others, it felt like magic. And I guess really that is our first clear sign that the machine was genuinely ahead of its time. Now, one of the biggest shocks for people who were seeing an Amiga for the first time was, well, it was hearing it. Most computers and consoles of the era generated sound electronically. I remember doing this on the Dragon 32 and putting little codes in BASIC to get it to do something. Now, the Amiga did something quite different. It played sampled audio, which meant that developers could use real recordings. They could use real drums, real instruments, real voices. So we would see in games like Shadow of the Beast, Turrican 2, Lotus Turbo Challenge, they just delivered soundtracks that still sound really, really impressive today. So the Amiga wasn't really just making noises, it was essentially reproducing audio in a way that just felt so much more modern than anything else that we'd seen at the time. And in actual fact, the tracker music scene that emerged around the Amiga would go on to influence countless musicians, composers, game developers, and for many people, the Amiga essentially wasn't just a pure gaming machine, it was a music studio. Now, there was a big challenger to the Amiga, the Atari ST, which had a little bit of early success, had a MIDI port, which meant that you could hook it up to a keyboard, which was absolutely incredible, actually. But when it came to the sound capability of the Amiga, it was just unmatched. Only really, again, when we saw the 16-bit consoles appearing later on, did we see sound on the Amiga, certainly in terms of the quality of sound that was being pushed out, being rivaled. But in terms of what you could actually do creatively, well, that wasn't matched for quite some time. Now, this is perhaps the most important part of the Amiga story. Most gaming systems were designed to let you consume content. The Amiga actively encouraged you to create it. So we had programs like Deluxe Paint, which just became legendary. Artists could use it to create game graphics, sprites, animations. The picture of that Egyptian mask still appears everywhere today as part of that marketing push for the 500. And we saw it again actually with the 1200 when they sort of did a side-by-side comparison to show how much things had improved. The tracker software, which we mentioned earlier, allowed musicians to compose songs and experiment with digital audio. Again, pretty revolutionary for the time. Animation packages left hobbyists producing surprisingly sophisticated visual projects. That rotating ball behind me is another commonly seen example which showcased animation capabilities on the Amiga. And for many young users, the Amiga became their first introduction to programming as well. For me, it was a little before, but for many, it was in the Amiga. And it wasn't unusual for someone to spend the afternoon playing sensible soccer and the evening learning how to code on the same machine. It was the machine that encouraged curiosity, and it invited innovation and experimentation, which is why we saw so many big software houses crop up in the UK and Europe. And in doing so, obviously, it was launching countless careers in technology, in design, and of course in game development. So if you've never seen an Amiga demo, you are seriously missing out. Now, the demo scene was a community of programmers, artists and musicians, creative people who competed to push the hardware beyond what anyone thought was possible at the time. The challenge wasn't just to make a game, it was to make people ask, how the flipping heck did you manage to get it to do that? Using clever programming techniques, developers would create visual effects, animations, audio experiences that often seemed, well, impossible on the hardware. And perhaps most importantly, of course, this wasn't happening inside major corporations, it was happening in bedrooms. Hence the bedroom coder scene that was really born out, especially in this part of the world, primarily across Europe. But, you know, we saw it everywhere, actually. And I'm hearing about people that were into this in other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, often by teenagers, actually. Many future professional developers got their start in the demo scene, and the spirit of experimentation it created and fostered can really still be seen in today's indie development community in 2026, which is absolutely amazing. So, now, if the Amiga was so incredible, then why the heck didn't it take over the world? Now, being ahead of your time, essentially, turns out, isn't always an advantage. The Amiga had limitations, for sure. Its storage remained very heavily reliant on floppy disks. A pretty big problem, I think, certainly towards the end of its life. The PC market was evolving rapidly. Business software increasingly standardized around the new IBM compatible systems and by extension MS-DOS and later Windows. And Commodore made a series of questionable decisions, that is an understatement, that really limited the platform's growth. While the Amiga was innovating, the rest of the industry was catching up, and they were catching up fast. And eventually, obviously, inevitably, they overtook it. And by the mid-1990s, PCs were becoming more and more powerful, especially from the sort of 486 era and onwards, and gaming was underway with breakthrough titles like Doom. Consoles like the PlayStation were changing gaming forever, of course, as well at the same time, and Commodore itself sadly collapsed in 1994, the same year that the PlayStation came out from Sony, of course. The future then had finally arrived, and unfortunately, it wasn't wearing a Commodore badge. Commodore, what could have been? The amount of times I've said that in the comments below, what could have been if things had been different. I think we would have seen PCs, Macs and Commodores. I think we would have just seen those things, and you could argue the same is true of the Acorn machines in the UK as well, but their legacy lives on a little bit through ARM perhaps. But yeah, it's a real shame that we don't see Amiga anymore, and there are a few people that yeah, they know who they are. There are a few people that made some questionable decisions, which just mean that is sadly not the case. Okay, so we are on the final stretch now of this video. So let's return to the original question then and ask ourselves, was the Amiga ahead of its time? Personally, I would have to say yes. Hand on heart, I would have to say yes. Because how could you not? And not because it predicted every technological advancement, and not because it was perfect, because it certainly wasn't. It had its limitations. We spoke about those, storage for one. But because it brought together ideas that wouldn't become mainstream for years. What do we have? Multitasking, digital creativity. We had that amazing sampled audio, multimedia, user-friendly graphical interfaces, creative software for ordinary people. That's before we've even spoken about any other games. These are now the things that we expect from every single computer. Heck, we even expect it from our mobile phones, right? But in 1985, these things were utterly remarkable and groundbreaking. So yeah, hopefully that was interesting. Let's go grab my final thoughts now and just wrap up this topic, and I will let you know what's coming up in the next couple of videos. I'll see you in there. So final thoughts on this matter then. I mean, yeah, the Amiga didn't become the dominant computer platform, sadly, in the end. It didn't win the business market. It didn't survive into the modern era, which is a crying shame. But that's not really why people remember it. People remember it because it showed them what computers could become. And for many of us, it wasn't just a machine, it was a glimpse into the future. And looking back 40 years later, that's probably the strongest evidence of all that the Amiga really was ahead of its time. Now, don't get me wrong, there were other machines there as well. We did have PCs, they were starting to grow, the Atari ST, we had the Acorn and the Archimedes in schools as well, which were really good machines. The Amiga just was something special. So what do you think? Do you think the Amiga was genuinely years ahead of its competition, or do you think that nostalgia has perhaps made us remember it a little more fondly than it deserves? I'd love to hear your thoughts, as always, in the comments below. And yeah, like I say, I've been blown away by all the comments and input that everyone's had over the last few videos. The engagement has been fantastic, and it's the most I've ever seen on the channel. So there's clearly some really strong feelings for this era, a lot of positivity for the Amiga, and some people that disagree, and that's great, and I love to hear your thoughts as well. So again, would love to hear your thoughts on this matter as well. Do you think that the Amiga was ahead of its time? And I didn't even talk about any of the hardware, and the reason for that is that next week, well, I'm getting on to the now and next, so let's just do that. Next week, we will be wrapping up the month with the Amiga, and I'm a little bit sad about that because it's been quite the ride this month. It's been an incredibly busy month. I've been trying to find some topics that have been engaging for people, and it seems to have paid off. Trying to play some games that I remember that I loved, and it's been really hard to pick a few games that I've really enjoyed. But yeah, we're gonna wrap it all up next week. I'm going to tell you what it's been like to live with the Amiga for the last month, and we'll talk a little bit about the hardware. I'll tell you how you can get back into it, and I want to tell you a few things about what's coming up on the Amiga scene in the next sort of year or so. Yeah, we'll cover all of that next week, and obviously I will tell you, of course, all the games I've been playing as well. So yes, so that's obviously coming up. There is time for one more bit between next week. Hope you enjoyed the bit betweens that I've been doing. So we did Stunt Car Race last week. We did Cannon Fodder on Wednesday this week, which has been really good fun. Yeah, we've done Magic Pockets and Lemmings. So some absolutely fantastic games. And at the beginning of the month, I also talked about some of the most essential games to play on the Amiga. So go check that out as well if you're interested in getting into Amiga, either for the first time or you're just returning to it. I've picked a few games that I think, in a few different categories that I think you might enjoy. So certainly games that I enjoyed, that's for sure. So go check that out as well. So yeah, that's all coming up. Obviously, after next week will be our new month with, and I will give you a clue. It's going to be a console next month, and I'm quite excited about this one, and I think it's a machine that doesn't get enough love. So you can probably start putting your thinking caps on and guess what that might be. But that is coming up very soon. Just leaves me to say, if you enjoy these videos, please do hit that like and subscribe button. I really appreciate it. I've had so many new subscribers just lately. It's been absolutely amazing. So thank you for joining. Welcome. Hit that bell icon for any notifications of any content coming up that you might be interested in. Yes, just leaves me to say, please do all take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next one. Until then, bye for now.